Good afternoon. I'm Commander Link Smith, the MOAA Public Affairs and Communication Professional Virtual Chapter President, and welcome to our virtual chapter meeting, 29 July 2026. Captain Kevin Wensing, United States Navy retired, who is our Speakers Bureau Chair, who will introduce our guest speaker. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Link. I'm so pleased that Adam Svolto is our guest today from the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. I think some of you may be familiar with USGLC, but Adam, welcome. And I'd love to have you kind of tell our MOAA members what, the kind of where USGLC started, what its mission is, and how we can maybe help support or get involved if we're so inclined. Because I think a lot of the people who are on our call, they know the importance of diplomacy and smart power and all of that. So I'll turn the floor over to you, Adam.
Kevin, thank you. Rich, thank you. Commander Smith, thank you very much for having me. It's just a great pleasure to spend some time with all of you this afternoon. And I'll share just a brief note on myself. I am a MOAA chapter member here in the Triangle chapter in North Carolina, where I'm based, and spent several years in advocacy before coming to the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. And before that, early in my career, I was an Air Force navigator, so flew C-130s and was active duty 1996 to 2004. So what I plan to do here is share a little bit about our organization, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, for those of you who may not be familiar, and then go a little bit into a deep dive on our international affairs budget and some of the returns on investment that we have seen over time on development and diplomacy, and then talk in particular about our Veterans for Smart Power initiative, which I lead at the coalition. And finally, we'll wrap up with a couple of ways that you can get involved and in ways that other members and other MOAA chapters have around the country. Okay, so the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, for those of you who may not know us very well, we've been in operation for about 30 years. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit 501c3. We bring together a very broad coalition of partners, folks in the business community, elected leaders, many folks in the nonprofit sector, some of whom deliver humanitarian assistance as part of their work, as well as veteran leaders. We have a pretty large representation of veterans in our network, as well as within our leadership structure. Most of the work we do is on education and advocacy, and in particular related to the international affairs budget. If you were to jump onto our website, you can see a number of our partners, and this is largely how we are funded. You will see representatives from across all industries within our corporate supporters, and many nonprofit organizations, including, for example, Catholic Relief Services, Samaritan's Purse, for example. And there's a lot of reasons why these organizations, in addition to wanting to make a statement about helping set the example as a global leader, there's also a very significant private sector interest in making sure that we have access to new markets. And that's one of the reasons why the corporate sector is such close partners with us. You'll recognize some of the faces here. When I say bipartisan, we are very intentional in working on both sides of the aisle. And you will see that reflected in our National Advisory Council, which is chaired presently by Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We're also fortunate to have, now it's up to about 280 retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals who serve as counsel and who participate in events around the country, join us in Washington, D.C. for visits to the Hill. They are incredible leaders, and we're fortunate to be able to learn from them routinely. In fact, I was just sharing with Kevin that I was in Pittsburgh with one of the members of our National Security Advisory Council, General Chris Burney, to talk with the veteran community there. This advisory council is chaired by previous CENTCOM Commander General Anthony Zinni and previous SOUTHCOM Commander General Laura Richardson. So I think this speaks to why we are involved. And you may remember the DIME principle from your various training programs. Back in the day, right? Diplomacy, informational, military, and economic levers of power. The role of USGLC is to really focus on all of the levers of power and to make sure that we are balanced in leveraging those. General Mattis put it pretty bluntly when he said, if you don't fully fund the State Department, I'm going to need to buy more ammunition. And indeed, we are all about going upstream to try to manage and prevent conflict in every case as we are able. So I'm going to shift now to talk about the international affairs budget itself, just to put some things into context, and hopefully this will give us, a common understanding of what these investments look like, where they go, and roughly the scope. So we call this the mighty 1%, right? So big picture numbers, our overall federal budget's about $7 trillion. 1% of that is 70 billion with a B. Over the past few years, and I'll show a slide that shows this trajectory. But fiscal year 25, we were at 58.6 billion. In fiscal year 26, our current fiscal year, the budget was passed well into the year. It was early spring, but that overall number, was $51.3 billion. Now we're here in fiscal year 20, coming up on fiscal year 27, and we are negotiating the budget. There's actually 12 appropriation bills, right, that make up the overall budget. The one covering the international affairs budget is but one of those, and we do not have a number yet. But what has been passed by the House is less than $51.3 billion. And so for us, our concern is making sure that we can maintain capacity as we are competing with China, as we are seeing many things erupt in the global landscape that requires our investment, our leadership, and creativity and dexterity in handling and managing those issues. So if you've not seen a slide like this, this is sort of roughly how our international affairs budget breaks down. And you will see a pretty large component on diplomatic and development capacity, international organizations and peacekeeping, for example, through the UN. We have a very large global health portfolio. Humanitarian assistance is really only around 11% or so. And this is the type of assistance that comes into play when there's, for example, an earthquake in Venezuela or other similar circumstances where we, often along with partners, will respond. Security assistance at 17%. Most of the international affairs budget comes through state foreign operations or the NSRP, National Security and Related Programs in the House. So there's the House process and then the Senate process, and eventually, generally, those are pushed into conference, and then there's a single bill that funds all of this. But state and foreign operations, about 49.7 billion. Again, this is what was passed in fiscal year 26. And then in the agriculture side, there's it's about $1.2 billion. That is for our Food for Peace program. That is the one component of our international affairs budget that is not included in the regular appropriations bill. That's through the Farm Bill. So what does it look like? Some of it are grants and loans direct to an implementing partner. For example, Catholic Relief Services may be doing global health work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, or other similar types of programming to achieve our goals. Knowledge and skills, training, capacity building. That's that informational power component that we referenced earlier in DIME. sharing our expertise to help other governments in development projects or other things, in-kind goods, infrastructure. This is largely through Millennium Challenge Corporation and the Development Finance Corporation, two really powerful tools in particular to help counter efforts in China as they expand their Belt and Road Initiative and take up quite a lot of attention in places that we have traditionally partnered with very closely. Some are direct support to governments, and of course, there are multilateral institutions to which we contribute and we participate, in particular UN peacekeeping. So this is just a quick visual on where the dollars go. You can see the very dark spot there in Central Europe. Of course, that is Ukraine. And some other spots that you might anticipate here, particularly in Africa, as well as a major partner in Latin America, Colombia. So a quick snapshot on what our historical funding trends. This is a 10-year snapshot on how the international affairs budget is waxed and waned. And of course, the nominal dollars, a straight dollar amount, the real is adjusted for inflation. So you can see that, not that long ago, we were investing a significantly larger amount of resources in diplomacy and development. Some key events that have influenced some of our decision making, right? Going back to the mid 1970s or so, the global war on terror, right, offered a spike here, 2001, 2002, 2003. And part of the reason for that is the recognition that fragile states, right, like some of those in Africa, provide breeding grounds for terrorist organizations to expand and to recruit. And it is in our best interest to make sure that we can work with partner governments to quell that expansion and to deal with the antecedents that likely give rise to extremism. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then we continue to watch, our investments here as we try to manage the multitude of global hotspots at the moment, from the Middle East to Ukraine to Venezuela. These are some of the initiatives that you may recognize. Some of them may be new to you. The Women's Global Development and Prosperity Program started under the first Trump administration. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, also known as PEPFAR, started under the Bush administration. Millennium Challenge Corporation has been an incredible tool, as I mentioned, as we try to counter China and their state-owned entities in locking up supply chains, particularly in Africa and Latin America. So I'm not going to stay too long on this slide. This is how the budget process is supposed to go. We know that we are often, and particularly in an election year, I think the prevailing knowledge is that we are likely to see a continuing resolution that will take us right into the next year. But we don't have a budget settled for fiscal year 27, which, as all of you know, starts on October 1st. But it is not likely that we're going to get a resolution here. If we were going to see a standard process, obviously, what generally happens is the House comes up with their budget, the Senate comes up with theirs. They're different. They negotiate. There's a conference committee named, and that conference comes out with a bill that both chambers give an up or down vote, and then it goes to the president. It is probably not going to work out that way this year. The prevailing knowledge is we'll see a CR. Okay, so the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition and the work that I do with the veteran community is all about impacting the trajectory of the international affairs budget, right? The overall set of resources that we can use to make sure we've got capacity for our efforts in diplomacy. And that isn't decided by everyone everywhere all the time, right? There's key committees of jurisdiction, and these are the ones that we focus on, again, beyond House and Senate leadership. It's the appropriations committees, and in particular, the House National Security and State and Related Programs Subcommittee, and in the Senate State Foreign Operations Subcommittee. Representative Diaz-Balart chairs the committee in the House, and Senator Susan Collins has recently stepped in for Senator Graham, who, of course, as we all know, recently passed away. She is the chair of the overall Appropriations Committee, but she is now leading on an interim basis here, SFOPS as well. And the other committees that are very important are House Foreign Affairs and Senate Foreign Relations, because of the influence that they have on major policy decisions that then we have to resource through our international affairs budget. All right, so this is kind of a busy slide, but I really want to just draw your attention to the first column and the last column, and really the apples to apples non-emergency funding. Okay, in fiscal year 25, I believe I mentioned we were at $58.6 billion. And then again, this is for that whole suite of programs and initiatives that serve our diplomacy and targeted international assistance efforts. The last column, fiscal year 26, a bipartisan conference bill is where we landed, right? We certainly went down by about $7 billion, okay, $51.3 billion. And that is where we are currently right now. And we are looking to the relevant committees to ensure that we're executing on that, on what has been set up for spending. What I will share is that for fiscal year 27, the administration's request was well beneath this number. It was around $35 billion, which would significantly handicap us with respect to our diplomatic efforts, but also what our combatant commanders need in the field. So again, looking at those two columns, where were the decreases from one year to the next? I'm not going to stay too long on this, but what I'll say is that our humanitarian assistance funding has been decreasing significantly. And this will impact our ability to build a reservoir of goodwill and trust with a lot of the partners and countries that we are looking to influence, and in many cases, competing for influence with China. All right. So what are the, sort of return on investment with respect to diplomacy and development? I mentioned the dime model previously, but all of these things work together to support our objectives with respect to economic security, national security, and projecting American leadership. And I'll give a couple of examples. 95% of the world's consumers or prospective consumers live outside of our borders. And we need to make sure that we are getting access to growing markets. And so our Ex-Im Bank, Development Finance Corporation, all of those are key to getting those channels open and keeping them open, especially as we compete with China. And one example of that is, the critical minerals effort. China has a massive share of processing and mining of critical minerals. One example is cobalt, which is something that we use on stealth aircraft and in munitions, and we need to not find ourselves in a spot where we're asking a rival for access to things like cobalt. And there's a clear national security element here. Not only is the international affairs budget and the work that it enables cost effective, it goes upstream to mitigate the risk posed by fragile states. There was a very recent International Monetary Fund study that found for every dollar we invest in the prevention of conflict, we save between $26 and $103 in crisis response. I'll say that again. For every dollar we invest, we save at minimum $26 and up to $103 in crisis response. And that includes and considers assistance and aid to people who have been displaced and reconstruction after a period of military conflict. So these are incredibly high returns on a very small proportion of our overall federal budget. One of the things that I talked about with General Burney in Pittsburgh, you may not know Lieutenant General Burney. He was a judge advocate general for the Air Force, and he was very involved in things like status of forces agreements and the types of agreements that enable access, basing, overflight, and intel. All of those things enable our execution of hard power if we can't prevent conflict and have to go in, right? Those are all things that allow us to extend our capacity. As a navigator myself, I benefited a great deal from intelligence briefings. Those were not just a function of what we could see from satellites. They came from relationships with people on the ground, and that was a function of a very strong and effective diplomatic corps. So I like to say, soft power is not just about soft power. It's not just about American values. It is about enabling hard power if we need to use it. We are far better if we need to do suppression of enemy air defenses in one country as opposed to four. And we had that support, for example, from Egyptians who escorted our bombers into Iran during Midnight Hammer just a year ago. So, Defense Secretary, development is cheaper than war, and this is absolutely true, and it has many benefits beyond just keeping peace. You may recall the example of South Korea. We invested heavily between 1953 and the mid 1970s in their reconstruction. South Korea is now our sixth largest trading partner. If you want to look at a sort of difference between governments and economies, et cetera, the juxtaposition of North Korea and South Korea is an incredible illustration of how democracy and a capitalist economy can help its population thrive. So, quick numbers, we see about $130 billion in imports from South Korea. And just last year, it was a roughly $75 billion in direct foreign investment from South Korean businesses here in the U.S. So this has turned out to be one of those incredible examples of moving from aid or development to trade. And indeed, I'll share this other statistic before we move on. 13 of our largest 15 trading partners were previously at one time recipients of U.S. aid. Okay, so Veterans for Smart Power. This is an initiative with membership extending through all of the states. I am working in a few key areas based on clusters of congressional districts where the congressional members play important roles on the committees of jurisdiction that we mentioned earlier. And critically, I try to look for members of Congress who are on those committees who are also veterans. And so one of the roles of Veterans for Smart Power is to facilitate connection between the veteran community, who carries a very special agency, having spent some time living foreign policy. I'm sure many of you have your own experiences with that. And engaging members of Congress and articulating why diplomacy and development are just as important as defense. And so we facilitate connections through digital advocacy, but also meetings in communities as well as on the Hill. And we would love for all of you, I'll share a link. I know Kevin has been affiliated with USGLC and the Veterans Smart Power program for a while. We would love for all of you to consider joining the VSP network. We don't have dues. We just ask that you stay tuned. We try to make it easy. We will hold virtual discussions. I've done stuff on Venezuela with a previous ambassador to Venezuela, Ambassador Patrick Duddy. Worked with General Chuck Wald on a conversation on Ukraine. We're going to be talking about advocacy on the Hill here coming up in September. So would love to have you join us for those discussions and maybe consider sharing your experiences through an op-ed. Join us in DC and hit the Hill. This is a QR code that you can use to sign up on our Veterans for Smart Power network, and you'll receive those communications and invitations to various events. Love to have you. Let me stop there.
Perfect. Good job. Thank you very much. And I would like to endorse the membership in the USGLC. I joined, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago, 9 years ago, or something like that. And it's a great way to kind of keep up to date on all the things happening around the world. So when you're, meeting with friends at cocktail parties or in groups you try, other groups you're involved in, you get some insights from USGLC that you don't get anywhere else. And again, the team that they built, the councils and so forth, all the retired, so you get a lot of different perspectives. So you can kind of come up with your own sort of solution from hearing all those. We're going to open the floor to questions. Adam, I had a couple quick questions, if I could. One was on the midterm elections and how you might see that impacting your budget or USGLC's mission. That'd be one. And the second question is sort of a funding question. Does USGLC? I can't remember. Do you get any like individual donations, or is it just kind of through your different foundations and so forth, and those kind of organizations that fund USGLC?
Two money questions. Love it. And I had to have a photo of C-130 here, so I couldn't leave the presentation without that. Anyway, midterm election. So, um, well, what I can say is, regardless of what happens, we're going to probably be offering the same exact advice to new folks and a new majority, should that be the outcome. Largely, our message will not be the same. I think, we may see slightly more favorable conditions if the majority changes with respect to some of our asks, and in particular, probably global health and multilateral organizations. But we've got to work with both the Congress and the administration. Certainly, the president has some veto leverage himself, and we've got to make sure that we're sharing the right advice with everybody. So I do think, to your question, impact of the midterms, what I anticipate. And I think what the electorate may communicate on some of this is will have the effect of some upward pressure on the overall international affairs budget. I believe that will be the case. And one example of that is, when you ask or poll the public, about 70% of voters, I guess those who responded to this poll, to be as accurate as possible, support investment at the rate of 1% of our budget in diplomacy and development. This is something that is a fairly common sense view amongst many voters, and again, I think that will find its way into the outcome.
I agree.
On
Like your slide on South Korea, if I could just, I was going to say, like your slide on South Korea, and you think of the Marshall Plan, and how successful those were to bring those, countries into sort of our sphere, our orbit. I think it's, very wise to do that. Of course, with Venezuela, the terrible earthquake, and the leaving of Maduro, and then Gaza and the destruction there, and President's plan to have this peace board to kind of reconstruct it, and then whatever happens in Iran, there's going to be a need, somehow for some rebuilding in Iran as well. So hopefully, we'll find the money to do that and bring those countries, within our sphere of friendship.
That's right. And all of this serves as a signal, right? We are in a contest of ideas. We are seeing this right in Iran as well. It's not just about individuals that we need to perhaps change. It's the way that the people of Iran actually can have a hold of and be self-determined through their system of government. And it does not seem, right, based on what we hear happens in the streets, that is the case. And one of the ways we win that contest of ideas is through projecting the best of American values and by leading and by setting the example. So to your point, Kevin, right, responding to the earthquakes in such a robust fashion as we did, and the administration is rightly proud of that. That was a multinational effort, including Latin and Central American countries as well. We need the resources to be able to do that, and there's no shortage of hotspots where, if we're smart, we can take the opportunity to set the example and engender strong confidence in the people of those places where we are undoubtedly, continuing to compete with China. And in Venezuela, if we're going to achieve democratic reform, we've got to have the confidence of the Venezuelan people. And so by responding in the way that we did and continue to do on the earthquakes, we're going to continue to build that confidence in that reservoir of trust. So our mission won't change. I think some of the resourcing may get better, but to your point, there is no shortage of needs for American leadership. On individual donations, you mentioned that one. No, I mean, most of our revenues, we're not a non-revenue, we're a nonprofit, does come from our member organizations within the coalition, and you could actually see all of them, a full list of them, if you were to go to our website. And some foundations, Coca-Cola, Gates. We've got a couple of other, foundation players. There are occasions certainly where individuals can make donations. That is certainly possible. And if someone in your network is interested in doing that, I'm glad to connect you with our development folks. But we certainly welcome that support. But most of how we resource our operations are through our member organizations, coalition partners who pay into being part of the coalition, as well as some foundations.
Adam, thank you very much for an outstanding brief. A couple of follow-up questions here. You mentioned the Millennium Challenge group. Can you expand on that a little bit? And also to China, over to China, the coalition's efforts to monitor the China Belt and Road Initiative around the world.
Sure. So first on Millennium Challenge Corporation, this is one of the bright spots, I think, in the budget over the past few years. Like the amount even that's projected for fiscal year 27 that came out of the House version of the budget holds the funding the same. With respect to Millennium Challenge, these are typically bilateral agreements with specific countries where we want to support development, support infrastructure projects, and there's typically a set of performance requirements with respect to what the receiving country would get. An example may be supporting the development of the Lobito corridor on the west coast of Africa to improve the movement of critical minerals from the internal part of the country, particularly like in Democratic Republic of Congo, out so that it can be moved easily by sea. And what that does is then accelerate a whole bunch of other development around those infrastructure projects. And so there would be, some type of commitment, performance, advantage for us for having contributed that. And it helps to push against the other part of your question, which is the China's Belt and Road. So we do monitor this very carefully. What I will say is that China's similar, international affairs budget in terms of what we have visibility on, has grown about 525% in the past 7 or 8 years. They have more diplomatic embassies and missions worldwide than we do. Not by a lot, but they have more than us and have for about 5 years. Another statistic, China has signed onto the Belt and Road 23 of the 33 South and Central American countries in our own hemisphere. And they have a very strong relationship with Brazil, which has, implications for us with respect to supply chains and agricultural markets. So we are very closely watching, and we agree with the administration's focus on our own hemisphere. However, it is really important that we're able to counter Chinese influence, offer alternatives to debt trap diplomacy that China tends to catch people in. The state-owned enterprises and the Chinese government has issued an incredible amount of loans over the past several years. The last number that I saw was around $385 billion. And these are structured such to be very predatory, and very long lasting, and to trap those countries that have entered into these agreements, with China for some of the infrastructure projects. Much of it is not reported to the World Bank, and so it is not clear how much influence, right, and money is changing hands. And that is one of the reasons why we got to be there. We're missing over 100 Senate confirmed ambassadors right now, and some of whom in the countries that are neighbors to Venezuela, where we're trying to make sure we can create regional stability. Same thing with a few key allies in Gulf states that we really need to signal their importance by having our ambassadors placed and confirmed. So those are a couple of the ways that we're keeping an eye on it. But we also need to make sure we are resourced well so that we can be present and not lose out on supply chain preference, and really deals that would have us favored over China, particularly, for example, in Africa and South America.
And follow on, Adam, are there any nations in our recent history that have pushed back against the debt trap, the predatory nature of Belt and Road?
Well, that is a really good question. How successful they have been, I am not sure. I think one of the tricks is to make sure that the World Bank is engaged and involved and that there's visibility. Um, but I don't know what that has looked like myself. I can't answer any specific examples of that. I just think that the structure and the requirements, that are the international expectation, really need to be upheld, and they are not. That's what allows China to take advantage, right? And so I think it's a really good question. I might engage our policy folks on and see if they've got a specific example of how countries have pushed back, and whether, perhaps regionally any of them are getting together and say, hey, this isn't the right way to go. It's not fair to us. But that's a really good question.
Yeah, I had a question about the funding too, in terms of how much of the funding, you talked a lot about the federal budgeting process, but I was also curious about all the members of the coalition on the commercial side, and what funding comes from them. And related to that, the other question I have is, I didn't hear much about relationships with existing international organizations like NATO or OAS.
Okay, so there's a lot there. So when I'm talking about budgeting for our international affairs, programs, this is all about federal money and whether or not Congress is appropriating enough, to cover what
Right,
um, we need in terms of capacity. When I think you were talking about our coalition, so the members of the
right.
USGLC coalition, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those are folks who are funding USGLC as an organization to go out and
Right.
do education advocacy, and to some degree, right, lobbying and working on
Mm-hmm.
trying to impact the decisions regarding the federal budget. So those members are just like paying into through their membership, right, fees, and they come in at different levels, and that is what goes into a sort of pot of money that resources our organizational efforts. Did
Right.
that
And do
answer
you
your
have a
question?
ballpark number for that? Okay.
For our own organizational budget, like
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
USGLC is, it
Yeah.
waxes and wanes a little bit each year, but I want to say it's somewhere on the order of, I don't know, 12, 13 million with an M. That it supports us, traveling and working with people, that it's, supports the events that we hold,
Mm-hmm.
all of those sort of things that help us do our programming. And then you asked about existing partnerships like
Mm-hmm.
NATO, came up in our discussion yesterday as well in Pittsburgh. And as many of you probably know, there's more than just Article 5. There's like other articles that is,
Mm-hmm.
when I see Commander Smith nodding his head, we need to work in a collaborative fashion, with our partners, and not plant seeds of doubt,
Mm-hmm.
because trust and confidence are the ingredients, right, of strength, capacity sharing, deterrence. All of those things follow what degree, of trust we have. I think it's a fair critique to say, and I realize this is recorded, but it's a fair critique to say that we have left some of our NATO partners questioning how much support, right, they can count on. And I think it's really important for us to be mindful of how much value NATO has offered and what it means for our ability, right, to project power through our NATO partners. It's incredibly important. One thing I will say about the administration's pressure on NATO allies to pay the 5% threshold to support the overall capacity. I find that to be value added to make sure that we've got robust participation by all of our partners and it's not disproportionately falling, that burden sharing on the U.S. And so I think there's some things that it seems the administration just objectively has pressured in the right direction, and maybe some things that we ought to encourage, particularly given our experience, the administration, right, and others in decision making, to preserve our relationships and our confidence with so many partners that have done a lot for us and have meant a lot for stability, particularly in Europe for many years. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm just curious, how much have your efforts been hampered by the hollowing out of the State Department and virtual elimination of the USAID?
Right. This was a really tough time for our organization last year, to be fair, right? A lot of the programming that we are talking about previously ran through USAID. Our disaster response teams were organized through USAID. All of that, though, now sits within the State Department. I think it has been pretty rough, and I understand through contacts, either directly or indirectly, within the State Department, that the sort of reconstituting of some of the functions of USAID has been bumpy. So to answer your question, it has not been helpful. I think we may have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. I think it's fair to say that there were some decisions that were made by USAID that didn't help USAID, if I'm speaking frankly. And some of the things sort of created a narrative that really stuck. And some of that was very unfortunate. But what we're most interested in is that those value-added programs are sustained, live on, and can do so through the State Department. All of it is about national security and security cooperation. I mean, all of these things work together to advance our interests. And so we are less concerned about what we call them and more concerned about the bottom line number that makes sure that they can still be in operation. But to answer your question very directly, it hurt. It left us open to losing ground to China, in particular in Africa. And there's some questions on how the sort of rebuilding in the Middle East happens with fewer resources and personnel and infrastructure there. So thank you for that question. But that's why we're doing what we're doing. That is the reason, right? We've seen a trend that's gone in the wrong direction, and some of the folks who can tell the story about why it's important really are those of us, who have worn the uniform.
Very good, Adam. Thank you very much for a very fine presentation, and we look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Consider our chapter a partner with the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition in the future. This is not a one and done. We'll be talking in the future without any question.